Welcome. My name is Ravi Da Costa. I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. As many of you all know, the Global Labour Research Centre is an organised research unit that's faculty-based. I'm chairing this process for a search in conjunction with our Associate Vice President, Research and Innovation, Jennifer Hyman, who's here. Members of the search committee are all here as well. Before I go further, I'd like to acknowledge the lands that we work on and the centre is based on. York University recognises that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which our campuses are located and that precede the establishment of the university. The university acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I also want to acknowledge the labour of many of our Indigenous colleagues and community members as well. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce Professor Adrian Smith, who's a colleague from Osgoode Hall Law School, and who is our candidate today. Just a bit of context, the GLRC is going about 10 years, had two distinguished directors, both of whom are here today with us, and this search will be for our third. The centre will be renewing its charter next year as well, so it's timely to be looking for a new director as well. So the event today will have a presentation from Adrian of about 15 to 20 minutes. Adrian has a few slides to share with us, and then we should have plenty of time, at least 40 minutes or so, I would hope, for conversation, questions and discussion. We've asked Adrian if he's comfortable with recording, and he is. There, as I mentioned at the start, there are a number of members of the community who are teaching and other things at the moment, so we'll make this available to them. If you don't wish your camera or comments to be recorded, obviously you can turn off your camera and mute yourself. If you do want any questions to be conveyed to Adrian, you're welcome to put that into the chat or email me directly. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to Adrian, please. Welcome.
That's great. Thank you. Are you hearing me okay, folks? Is that, yeah, great. Just let me know if things go awry, which often happens in these circumstances. But at any rate, thank you all for joining today. Happy to see some familiar faces and some new ones, and also to put some names to faces and so on. So pleased to be speaking to you today. I guess what I'll do is I'll give you a little bit about myself, and then I'll turn to the slide deck, and in my brief time, just give you a sense of the focus that I would take if I were selected for this position. So I've been around Osgoode Hall. I guess this is my second tour of duty, as it were. So I was a student at Osgoode in the late 90s. At the time, undertaking what was called an LLB. I guess we've now changed the terminology to JD, same difference, more or less. And so the 3-year degree, during that time, I started to sort of deepen my interest in the regulation of labor, the legal regulation of labor, focusing in on areas of labor and employment law, but also migrant justice, global development or critical development studies. And important to note that at the time, I felt that there was a strong tradition, sort of a critical or even radical political economy tradition rooted in Osgoode, with folks like Judy Fudge and Eric Tucker, Harry Glassbeak, amongst a number of other folks, and Michael Mandel and so on. And I count all of those folks as sort of part of the tradition which my work comes out of. I came back to Osgoode after a quick stint at a law firm, and I undertook my master's studies with Eric Tucker, master's in in law, which was focused on labor law, the intersections, in fact, of corporate law and labor law. And at the time, I was really wrestling with questions about why we discipline law in the way we do. Why is it that we treat labor law as a sort of insulated silo, or corporate law as an insulated silo, as though the two never meet? And yet I would see all of these ongoing examples of where they intersect and collide, often in violent ways that undermine the lives and livelihoods of ordinary people, workers in particular. So that research, along with beginning work with migrant workers, migrant justice circles, kind of launched me into my doctoral studies, which I undertook at McGill, doing a sort of historical project on the relationship between the legal regulation of enslaved workers into the sort of a period and transition of indentured labor into the sort of contemporary, at the time, contemporary moment of the 20th century, watching the sort of legal regulation of sugar workers in particular in the Caribbean context in Trinidad and Tobago. And so now, from there, I went on to Carleton, where I took on my first teaching appointment. I was appointed in the Department of Law and Legal Studies, but also cross-listed at the Institute of Political Economy, where I, for a couple of years, taught the doctoral seminar for students that were in the political economy program, but also had supervisory responsibilities, and then also cross-listed to the Institute of African Studies by virtue of my work's connection with the sort of, I guess, wider African diaspora, especially with respect to the work related to migrant justice. So following that sort of 7-year stint at Carleton, I returned back to York at Osgoode, where in July 2018, I took on the position of the academic director of the Parkdale program. It's the poverty law program. It's the sort of cornerstone of, or at least one of the cornerstones of Osgoode's social justice tradition, now going on 51 years, I believe. So I had been a student there in the Workers' Rights Division back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I returned as academic director to lead that for a few years. And now I find myself teaching outside of that program for now, but I continue to be on that roster. And along with other colleagues, I'll return to that position in about a decade or more, depending on how things shake out. So in my general teaching, I've taught in collective bargaining law, labor law. I've also been the co-director and continue to be co-editor in chief of the Journal of Law and Social Policy, which is also a kind of a social justice based student-led journal, which has a course requirements attached to it. And in addition to that sort of stuff, I've also been doing Labour College of Canada teaching, at least on 4 occasions, with my friend Catherine Ostofsky, who's here. Great to see you, Catherine. Thankfully beginning that work because of Aziz Chowdhury. And our shared interests, both in migrant justice, but also in worker education. And that's really what I want to focus on in my brief remarks today. So I'm sure I skipped over some details that I had wanted to tell you, but happy to kind of fill in some blanks if folks have any questions about my background and so on. Let me turn to the slide deck now and sort of just talk you through what I think would be my interest and focus. So worth noting that, of course, I'm very familiar with the center and the work of the center, and have tangentially been participated in events with the center and observed, although admittedly, especially given the sort of demanding role of the academic director at Parkdale, haven't been fully immersed in the center's work, at least in my sort of beginning days in my return back to York. And then of course, pandemic hit and sort of still, as a number of you folks, trying to sort myself out in terms of research and so on. But one of the things I'd like to say as a sort of opening salvo is really just that I found the work of the center, the existing work, to be quite important. And I think it would be worth saying that I would be committed to continuing some of that existing work. I think two examples here is the COVID, and I know there's sort of multi-dimensions to this COVID-19 World of Work project, but I think that's certainly a compelling and invaluable project that needs to be continued with connections through the center. And I think also there are important more expressly student initiatives, especially the multimedia ones, that I think would be important to continue and also align with my some of my own research interests that I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer period. But at any rate, it's worth saying that I wouldn't, and I think you'll see this as a theme of my remarks today. My point, my aim is not to go in and radically change things. In fact, I quite want to be honest about this. I think I would take a much more modest, ambitious, but much more modest approach as the director, one that aligns with, I think, the needs of workers, organizational needs of workers, precarious workers in particular, and that would align with worker education initiatives. I'll talk through that. But also something that takes seriously what I'm hearing from colleagues themselves and what I feel, which is something like the challenge of this moment, which is not to just go out and create more make work projects, create more events for the sake of it, but to do things that would bring folks together. I know people are feeling tired, if not exhausted, frustrated, politically and emotionally and otherwise. And I think then the center can fit a particular need in this moment. And so that's what I want to speak about as well as we go forward here. So notwithstanding the fact that then I would continue some of these existing projects, I would also look for areas of potential development. And I think there were two in particular that are speak to my own work. One, as you can see here, is related to the sort of place of Canada within global labor studies. And perhaps we might even say the other way around, how not only where does Canada fit in global labor studies, but where does global labor studies fit within the sort of notions of Canada. And of course, you can see here, I have Canada in quotations, sort of noting the important challenges we've seen, both in terms of, not just both, but certainly in terms of the long-standing challenges to the Canadian State Authority and so on, which come from Indigenous initiatives related to self-determination, cultural resurgence, and so on. But also with respect to the challenges we see within the context of fields and the study of migration, labor migration, which I would incorporate in that context. Also immigration and refugee studies as well, and we can talk about the intersections of those. The second area, as I've already mentioned, would be around worker organizing and education, ensuring that the thrust of the work of the center would be around helping to support colleagues, and by that I mean students and faculty members, to ensure that they are operationalizing their research to speak to the organizing and educational needs of workers, especially precariously employed, marginalized or unfree workers. So let me try to talk through some of this. So very briefly, I think this is sort of self-explanatory here. The Canada and global labor sort of theme that can be developed or further developed would extend to the numerous folks who are working on things like labor migration on campus, but also extractivism. And I think in addition to that, those who are engaged in questions around Indigenous self-determination, including, of course, it is expressed in sort of the current parlance, land back, and thinking about the labor dimensions of that, but also really trying to have folks understand that the center can be a space in which we work through the questions and challenges that are posed by those interventions. And so I see the center as an opportunity to further develop some of those discussions by bringing those folks who are already doing that work together and talking about it in the context of thinking about Canada's place in global labor. And as I said before, also global labor and what it means for the way we appreciate or understand this thing called Canada. And I think there would be other areas in which we could extend that and reflect upon that as well. A couple of quick examples that I often reflect upon myself are related to housing markets, precariously constructed housing markets, and foreignness as it's constructed and how it intersects with labor. The exclusion of foreign ownership in housing markets and what that means for our notions of how we study work and labor. And also things related to sort of like pensions and the work that Canadian pensions are doing in the world, especially in the context of Americas, and supporting quite at times draconian and backward forms or modes of development that undermine the subsistence and existence of ordinary people in other parts of the world, and including in Canada. I think those kinds of projects can be filtered in and developed through sort of collaborative exercises in the center. The second is in the context of the existing theme of the revitalization of workers' movements, is to find ways to have worker education proliferate in the projects that people are already undertaken. Here, I'm seeing just you know, a desire to develop further what the center has already tried to do and is attempting to do, and I think at times quite well, is first pick up on what's been a multi-decade kind of call to revitalize worker movements. Of course, the question of what we mean by revitalize is an important one in and of itself. What is it referring to? Is it referring to a sort of a golden age of the post-war moment? And if it were referring to a golden age, to what extent did that golden age actually capture the realities of people on the ground? We knew that precarious employment, you know, and we've come to kind of a real understanding now that precarious employment existed even in that golden age. We know that our migration and immigration regimes were exclusionary in racist and deeply troubling ways during that golden age. So revitalization, there's a question there about what we actually mean. But I think perhaps if we were to replace that with an understanding of just building workers' movements, then we can see that worker education is centrally important to that. And we at this institution and through this center can be a part of supporting that. And I think we can be as part of supporting that through the center's community engagement model, and specifically by supporting the development of our research projects into popular education initiatives. And so having folks think about that, the research that they're already carrying out, how do we turn that to popular education or worker education is what I think I would like the center to emphasize during my time. And I'd like to work through an example of that if I can. And the Know Your Rights fact sheets that the center has would be one way we can think through this, which is kind of in my wheelhouse, given that, of course, we're talking about workers' rights and law in that story. And what I want to do is just show you the complexity of that in some respects, and then ultimately then demonstrate quickly I think why I can make a contribution to the support of the development of popular education initiatives like Know Your Rights fact sheets that aren't just left at the fact sheet, but can be brought into wider initiatives in the popular education or worker education realm. And so I want to give you two examples if I can. I realize we might be running close to time, but two quick examples. One is a pretty simple example. The other is a little bit more complex, but let me work through them all the same. So just take a moment to read this quote. Many of you would recognize it. You would recognize it most likely because it was sort of, I believe, the opening quote in Panich and Schwartz's, Donald Schwartz's From Consent to Coercion. It, of course, is, which was in itself, I think, a formative text of labor studies, had multi-editions and so on. But you also would know that Pierre Trudeau went on from being a labor lawyer in the asbestos strike to, of course, being prime minister. And so you get, in one sense here, we get an articulation, I think that is largely right here, that the trade union movement becomes nothing more than one institution among many in the service of capitalism if it does not have a meaningful right to strike, if we can call it that for now. So if you can imagine a fact sheet talking about the right to strike in labor law and using this quotation, while largely, I think, accurate, the quote, it's certainly without, if taken outside of the context that then Trudeau goes on to be a central figure in, the context in which we see Trudeau participating in a series of interventions which impose wage restraints and other kinds of restrictions on the collective capacities of workers to take collective action. It would be problematic for us to just put a quote like this out in the world on, say, a fact sheet without talking about the other side of Trudeau's works. It would be problematic because it doesn't get to the idea that law is part of political economy and needs to be taken up in a critical way as part of political economy. And Trudeau's interventions in wage restraints and through the anti-inflation initiatives and so on is, I think, exemplifies that. So we would need to have a more complex reading of law that wouldn't just take it on the face that Trudeau presents it here, but also puts it into the political economic context. And that requires a layered kind of analysis. And I think that's the kind of layered analysis that worker education fact sheets and initiatives would need. Let me give you a more complicated example. So take a moment to read this quote.
Maybe just a couple more minutes.
Yeah, for sure. And here we can see this famous sort of quip by Anatole France, who in the Red Lily said that law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in streets, and to steal bread. And in this context, you could think about fact sheets again that are focused on engaging with workers on labor law, but in engaging with workers on labor law, it could again be the right to strike. There would be a need to get to and uncover this dimension of law here that France is trying to take us to, which shows us that there is a violence which comes with liberal legality through its claims to treating people formally equal. A violence that ignores the underlying material conditions of people who have to, in fact, sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal bread. And so in order for us to engage in a more robust mode of worker education, we would need to not just present law on its face, but also do the work of developing critiques of, or should I say, not present labor law on its face, but do the work of developing more rigorous critiques in language that speaks to workers about liberal law, state law itself. That's a complex task that I think folks can turn their minds to, and I think the center can be a part of as an example of the work that can be done. So in other words, not just presenting fact sheets, but doing the other kinds of work that's required. So just briefly, as a way of ending them, let me turn to what I think then is my claimed contribution here, which is, as I say, attempting to not reinvent the wheel, but help to mobilize knowledge, existing knowledge of research projects in ways that take folks to the ability of these projects to become worker education initiatives. I think that the center can support that work. I think it needs to be work that students, faculty, all colleagues need to be engaged in if they're serious about making contributions that speak to the building of the labor movement and what is needed today, especially for precariously employed workers. I have some other thoughts I'd like to address, but I'm sure they'll come up in the Q&A, or if not in the interview. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Adrian. Thanks very much for sharing those ideas. Yeah. So we've got around about 30 minutes. Please, who would like to comment, make a question? I'll try and keep an eye on all the chat and so on. Please go ahead. Not seeing anything just yet. Yeah, Carlo, please go ahead.
Sorry, folks, took me a second there to find my unmute button. Hi, Adrian, good to see you. Long time no see. Thanks for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And it's great to see you in your new role here. Some of you may know me, Adrian, go back to our Carleton days. So it's great to see Adrian and some of his work. And I really liked how you started your presentation, tying it to your own autobiographical research. and some of the initial impetus for the research you've conducted. I was struck by some of the parallels with your own research and my own, of course, and especially the Anatole France quote, which I use as actually Matthew could speak to this. I think he was in that class, by law, labor, and the state class, where we use this as kind of a launching point to discuss some of the criticisms of liberal law's treatment of that. So I was wondering, do you see any, I really liked how you connected your research to the service and your own intellectual background, but do you see any marquee events that you could think would serve as an opportunity for some of these collaborative engagements which you've been discussing? For instance, bringing community members, trade union folks, different nonprofit institutions or organizations together, of course, other academics and universities. So do you see any type of event that where, these folks could coalesce in ways that perhaps they had been unable to in the past for various reasons? It's a broad question. I don't know if there's any specific, answer here, but of course, some of this is thinking out loud. But if there is such a thing, I'd be curious to hear what you think that is.
Should I take each question one by one, or what would you?
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, I think we've got a bit of time. Yeah, please go ahead, and then we can come to Mark's question.
Okay. Hey, Carlo, good to see you. Thanks for coming. I think you might be on leave right now, so I really appreciate it, especially if you are. And thanks for the question. So marquee events. So I want to be careful here. So in one sense, yes, it's exciting for me to sort of think about how to do this. And I think but Catherine and I, for example, have talked about this both in the context of the work we do at the Labour College of Canada, where we are trying to think about, how to develop in a kind of and scale up the worker education project that's happening there. That worker education project at the Labour College is focused primarily on unionized folks. They're already sort of, the privileged within, organized labor. And I think both Catherine and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, Catherine, are really committed to thinking about precariously employed workers, non-unionized workers, and how do we bring worker education to them. We've already got some work going on, largely through Catherine's really hard work that will happen during Congress to commemorate the work of Aziz Chowdhury, social movement learning and action work of Aziz Chowdhury. We're going to do a kind of a full day session. Part of that session in the afternoon, Catherine has taken the lead in organizing, is going to bring in folks specifically that are going to be engaged in this kind of thinking and thinking about how do we extend this work into the future. So I really like the idea of harnessing the center's resources, the resources of our institution, and also noting our obligation and responsibility as an institution to do the work of organizing the most marginalized workers in our society. And I think there's a number of initiatives, small and big, that can come from this. And I'm excited to harness the center to do that work. I think, especially if we, in the decades-long conversation that you already know about revitalizing the worker movement, like, people have been calling for us to do this work for a long time. It's been happening in bits and pieces. And I think it's time now that we organize the, in quotations, unorganized. And Catherine, for example, is bringing in folks from Amazon and others. We know, my connections in the migrant justice circles. We are all constantly having these small discussions and so on. So I can see those kinds of things happening. But in another sense, I don't want to overstate what it is I think the center should be doing as well. I don't think this is the time to just start having event after event after event without it being grounded in substantive collaboration, meaningful collaboration. We're all tired of make work projects. Folks are saying, whispering in the back rooms and stuff about this, people being over capacity. And I know from reading the annual report of the center, it's been hard work to get the support of all faculty members to participate in the center. So I'm cognizant of that as well. And I think we all have to adjust maybe this is a problematic statement, but we have to adjust our expectations. And the way that we can do it is by ensuring that our research projects flow into what I'm calling the sort of focus on worker education initiatives, rather than new kinds of initiatives that aren't necessarily directly related to the needs and desires of researchers, but also the movement itself. So I hope that answers your questions, Carlo. Thanks again.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adrian.
Mark, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Adrian, for your presentation and also for your interest in the position. It's great to see you, and it was great to hear you talk about what you have in mind. And my question actually was a little bit, I think you may have anticipated some of it, or it was captured in some of the response that you offered to Carlo in some really interesting ways, but I'll continue it, and maybe we can go further with the discussion about what we might see as, I don't want to say a divide, but certainly distinctions between the organizations that represent and work with and organize non-unionized workers, and then the trade union movement. And the center has a history of partnerships with trade unions, and also has a history of working with organizations in sort of the non-unionized and realm of precarious work. And you mentioned some of these kinds of distinctions or divisions in your early response. And so I guess just picking up on some of that, how would you approach these different kinds of organizations that will have similar, ultimately similar aims, that being, to organize workers, but with different sets of resources, different capacities, and sometimes different politics and orientations to those questions. And so as a director, I guess, what would your approach be in reaching out and trying to bring in these disparate kinds of groups?
Yeah, that's thanks, Mark, for that. I know Mark as well, so great to see you as well, Mark. And thanks for this challenging question. It's kind of like the question that I'm not sure I have kind of one answer to. But I just want to say something that a colleague said to me the other day, which I thought was really kind of reverberated with me, and I've been thinking about for a long time. So, I see myself as centrally part of this movement of organizing, a movement of workers, broadly stated, but I'm not a mouthpiece. And I don't think the center can be a mouthpiece for that movement. So that does put us in situations at times where we have to have difficult conversations. Uncomfortable things have to be said out loud. I am comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with the discomfort of that. I've kind of, spent my days kind of practicing that kind of stuff. For example, talking about racialization and racism generally in polite society forces you to be comfortable with the discomfort of that. But I think specifically within the labor movement itself, much of the stuff that I've been engaged in with respect to migrant justice is anchored in having to speak to uncomfortable topics within groups that would otherwise be allies, including trade union folks and so on, or trade union officials at least, ignoring the rank and file for a moment. So I think as a general proposition, that's a tension. For me, I think it's that we want folks to realize that, perhaps slightly romantic, but the university can be a space in which we have those difficult conversations. It has to be. I feel as though we've lost or at least maybe never had too many of those spaces available in the first place. So why not a center like ours as an opportunity to do that? That requires certain kinds of rules of engagement on our side, but also in quotation on the side of others, that where there would be disagreement. but rules of engagement don't mean we can't disagree and can't disagree vehemently. In fact, I would insist upon it. It's kind of what I believe teaching is about. And it's finding ways to do that then. So that's the general answer. In terms of bringing in those kinds of organizations, though, that would otherwise disagree and navigating that, I would also rely heavily on colleagues, students, and faculty and their connections. Like, again, I'm making no promises of reinventing the wheel. There's been good work that's been done and continues to be done through the center and in the wider institution at York in these circles. And I would rely heavily on those folks to continue that work, and including here, bringing in groups that disagree and ensuring that we can have those difficult conversations. A last point would just be to say, we've seen some, at least in a modest sense, some sort of a way forward in some respects with the QP education support workers stuff that's gone down and the coalitions that formed in that moment out of that real draconian intervention from the provincial government, right? Like, the kind of invocation of the notwithstanding clause and so on. And we saw then folks talking to each other from different trade unions that hadn't spoken for quite some time. I think that forces on us, the pandemic did as well, a different concept of time, temporality. Actually, I know you've been working on some respects, Mark, on a project related to time and temporality and labor. And I think this too shows us that, like, we need to get outside of the linear conception of time that sometimes our social movements and social change operate on, and realize that the possibilities become available to us in a snap, in a snap of a finger, because of something a government can do that's draconian as it's imposing a notwithstanding clause, or something as tragic and troubling as a global health pandemic. We can see time shifting and possibilities emerging out of that. So I would be open to having those groups understand that this is the time that this is the space that we need to sort of talk through our differences, so we can have some commonalities to move forward and really ensure that marginalized workers are supported in their struggles.
Super, thank you.
Thank you. See any more questions, please? Plenty more time. Maybe while people are considering what else they might ask, just maybe building on some comments you made earlier, Adrian, I think perhaps in relation to the project you described you were doing with Catherine, who I don't think we've met yet, but I'm struck in the last couple of years, the faculty, and I imagine across the university as well, but we've had a number of colleagues who are working on platform labour, in particular in the School of Information Technology, in the School of Human Resource Management, as well as in social sciences and elsewhere. And I sort of wondering, I mean, I imagine that it's very, very much those groups are amongst those that you are thinking about in that work. Could you speak to what some worker education strategies might be for those kinds of groups, particularly in folks doing mechanical Turk and those kinds of, which is I was struck to learn of the scale of it globally. So, if you've got any thoughts about what kinds of projects or campaigns might be useful in relation to those.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ravi. Lots of folks are doing work thinking about this, so I won't pretend that I'm an expert in any regard on this, but including my colleague Valerio De Stefano, who's hired as a research chair in the last couple of years, brought from Italy, and he's kind of a well-known expert on this in the European context at the very least. So Yeah, these are great questions. I know Eric Tucker, also my colleague who's just retired, did important work on this, especially related to the sort of gig economy stuff and the Foodora case and so on. And I think, you know, we know that these are workplaces that are kind of spread out and splintered, and difficult to get access to workers and so on. So that's kind of one dimension of things. And then there's also the kind of idea that folks are working across platforms for different entities and organizations. So there are questions that need to be asked about how do we kind of push back against that fragmentation, as Fudge and Tucker would have said if they were here. And so we do have a sense of how to do that. We've been talking about that now for quite some time. Fudge and Tucker's articles from 1999, I believe, and the book that they wrote is in 2000, before Labor Before the Law. And you know, I think it's about the hard work of folks getting into those spaces and trying to speak to people and building from there. But I think we can be a hub in which that is done, and we can help to support the I hate the word training, but training of folks who will then go out and do that kind of work as well, and then be brought back to the center, and or we can go and meet them in their places and spaces. Cup W has done some of that. I was privy to some of the work they were doing quietly when they were doing it through the Labor College, and you know, we were talking quite extensively about the sort of real kind of like informal kinds of discussions that need to be had, the tools that workers would need, including again things like fact sheets, but also things that the fact sheets that don't reinforce. They give you information about law, but then also then sometimes reinforce a kind of a liberal legality or a commitment to the state authority, and we need to get outside of that. And so in many respects, I've tried to speak about that in my presentation today. And I know that's not a too specific an answer for you, but I think we do have some ways in which we can get in and speak to this deeply fragmented workforce. And as you say, one that is kind of massive in the global context. So hope that helps in some respects start to answer the question.
Thank you. Yeah, Catherine, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Adrian, for your presentation. Obviously, I think your plan is excellent and obviously aligned, and I'll speak for Carlo here. Sorry, Carlo. It definitely aligns with work and labor studies, what we're trying to do there as well. And so, yeah, it's very exciting. Even though you're quite modest in this idea of your role as a facilitator, bringing folks together, I think that's exactly what we need right now. And, you know, I think, you know, you spoke to it a little bit, but I think your rootedness and or as an organizer and with these with communities that are doing organizing with workers movements is, you know, you bring something that's really essential there. So I'm very excited to see how you bring folks together, or how we do as the GLRC participants and executives. So my question though, is what you think about the role of students. So, you know, we focus a lot on research and on faculty and involvement, and that's great. But I guess I've been thinking a lot, Carlo and I have been discussing a lot, you know, the role of students and how do we engage students? How do we, you know, how do we get them, how do we help them also with that kind of capacity building and organizing? And worker education. Most of them are workers themselves, right? And so that's something I'm thinking about within our program, but I think it aligns very closely with your vision. So I'd just like to hear more about how you see students, the role of students.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And I liked your correction there when you said how are we going to bring these folks together. I think that's really the point that I'm trying to make today, is it can't just be on the responsibility of one person as a director, notwithstanding the fact that the director does have responsibilities. So I think the kind of the student stuff is quite interesting and important here. And I hope that I know at times it sounds as though you're right. I'm speaking just strictly to sort of researcher, and sometimes then we just instinctively turn to think about the sort of faculty members rather than students as researchers. But my kind of conception of research is about the kind of fluidity of teaching and learning. And so I don't ever sort of essentialize one versus the other. I think it's a kind of an organic process. And again, that comes in many respects out of the kinds of traditions that you and I are both interested and committed to, including the work of Aziz Chowdhury. And so I align with that. And so I think giving opportunities and spaces for students to themselves self-organize and support them in that is supremely important to me. I don't necessarily think faculty members have to, and let me say it differently. I think sometimes faculty members get in the way of really the initiative and the vitality of students. If I was to be honest, I would say at times I felt like that as a student. I had the most amount of time to read. I had, it was a generative kind of time, but then felt at times I was being undercut by structural and other things. And I think faculty members were part of that story at times. That doesn't mean that I didn't have my own set of problems as a student, but I will leave that for another day. So what I would like to do is sort of help to support the development of those kinds of initiatives, bringing students together to talk about specific kind of organizing issues, and informally and otherwise, the ones that they're faced with as workers, right? Students as workers, and the ones that they want to take up, and creatively supporting them to sort of think creatively about how to take these up, including in the kind of formal research context, but also informally as they operate in those spaces as workers, I think would be important in that regard. And I don't think it has to be fancy stuff. I think, the kinds of organizing that I'm been kind of committed to is being kind of embedded in movements and playing that out over an extended period of time. And I think as long as students kind of commit to that, and other researchers, I think, and we give space to talk about the challenges, difficulties, and so on, then I think good things can happen. I've seen it in the context of migrant justice organizing. And I would even say my own research, it's not only comes from that, but it's deeply reliant on that process. If it wasn't for migrant organizing and my ability to be on the ground or have folks from organizations like Justice for Migrant Workers on the ground and being engaged with them, I would never be able to develop the kinds of research that I've been able to develop. So those are some ideas. Having students, read across disciplines is really important to me. So as an example, Mark is here, but my labor and employment law students read Mark Thomas and Stephanie Ross's chapter on organizing in precarious times, or whatever the title is, Mark. And it was very generative for them, especially because I was taking them to questions of organizing, but they had no experience in it, yet they were living it themselves. They were living these sort of working as precariously employed workers or having family members working in those contexts. And they wanted to know, okay, so how do we, not just have a critique of law per se, but also turn to the question of organizing. And so a piece like that helped them immensely. It was littered throughout their final take-home exams or answers and stuff. So I think inviting cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary engagements as well. And that can be done through, again, small sessions in which we read stuff together. I'm more than willing. I do this for all of my grad students. I read stuff with them. We think about it out loud. that's what I would like to be able to do as well. But I think other faculty members need the space and support to do that as well. Again, it can't just fall on the director. And if that happens, I think interesting things can happen out of those processes. So just a bit of a response to your question, I hope, Catherine. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Adrian. I just, Louis, I saw your hand. I just noticed in the chat comment from Shruti that I realized maybe a question about involvement of students, which you did just speak to. So hopefully, Shruti, that addresses some of your question.
Thank you. Yes, it did. Thank you so much. And sorry, I forgot the question mark.
No, it's okay. Luann, please go ahead. We've got a couple more minutes. If people are able to stay for a couple more minutes.
Okay, you're okay with that? The first thing I want to do is check that Shruti's question was answered. So thank you, Ravi. Thanks so much, Adrian. It's great to see you and to hear your background and your vision for where GLRC might go from here. I love the emphasis and the commitment to popular education. I think that's great. And trying to work at the margins, right? Or even people who are beyond the margins. I wondered, in bringing it back to, so here we are in the context of the university. And I wonder if you can say just briefly, ideas that you have for supporting researchers, professors, as well as grad students and undergrad students, but in particular, supporting ways to support researchers in this time when, as you said, people are tired and worn out and overcommitted. What ideas do you have for engaging faculty members from across the full range of disciplines at York, and supporting them in research that they want to do, that, and also inviting them into the priorities that you would like to set for the GLRC?
Yeah, thanks for that. And also, obviously, thanks for all of the work you've done with the GLRC, which again, I hope to just continue in that role. And I know that part of the work you've done is to support folks in terms of the kind of development of funding applications, the kind of work that research officers do in some regard, but more pointed because of this, the specialization, if you will, of having feedback, peer review, and so on from people within the fields or field of labor studies, if we can call it that. So continuing that work seems quite important and vital. I think that, again, the director needs to be doing that kind of work, but also finding colleagues who are going to be engaged in that peer review work, for sort of more privileged colleagues supporting those who are new or in positions of challenges related to childcare, elder care, and so on. And I think that's the kind of substantive work that a director can do. It's not easy work by any stretch, but it's important work at this time. And so making those connections, I think, would be something that I could do and I would want to do. And that would be with respect to the development of formal research applications through the entire phase of that. And of course, I understand as well that the center not only helps with sort of the pre-development or the development stage, but also with the administration of funding grants and so on. So supporting that as well, and ensuring that colleagues who are doing work in and around labor studies understand that the center can be and should be a sort of a source of support and in fact leadership in terms of administration of funding applications. So I think that's quite important. And in terms of setting priorities, then, I think the kind of the strategy for me would be to reach out to folks as early as possible, and start to get a sense of what folks are doing around the university, especially early researchers, and thinking about ways in which they can incorporate popular education or workers' education into their projects, and in turn, how we can support the development of those projects. And even if it's just through my direct participation and helping them think that through, or bringing together other colleagues associated with the center to help them do that in informal ways, I think we should do that. And again, I don't think, while the center is housed at York and it has a space at York, going to researchers, meeting them where they physically are at, and bringing some colleagues to do that kind of work and thinking it through, doing it virtually, could be the work that the center can do to help foster the development of those projects, and then in turn develop the themes and focus of the center. So those are some ideas. With respect to students in that regard, I think there's a kind of a special importance for the center to make sure that students who are coming on campus that want to be engaged in labor studies are directly connected with the center. It has to be that way. And again, it has to be that way both in terms of the center deriving the energies and innovation of students that comes at the sort of at that level, but also then finding ways to informally support and formally support students. Some of that goes beyond the center and into the institution itself. We know that, but there are lots of informal ways in which grad students can be and others can be supported, including by, for example, I hold with my grad students a forum kind of on a semi-regular basis in which they can come and talk about their ideas. We'll read something for them. It's grad students speaking to grad students with my participation. Those informal kinds of engagements to me are the most valuable, to be honest.
Well, Adrian, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for all of your questions and comments. I think we should pause there, give Adrian a few moments, and the interview, the panel and Adrian will convene. We've got a separate link for that. We'll start maybe around 2:40 or just after. And yeah, we'll let the community know in the next few weeks the next steps. So thanks again, everyone. And
thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Sorry, Ron. Thanks.